Yeah, thanks for joining, Daniel. 150th year for the Saints. So much to chat about. Not just a big milestone for the club, but also Ross the Boss coming back. Whole host of favourite sons. Robert Harvey, Lenny Hayes, a whole host of people. Brendan Goddard, Nick Del Santo still coaching AFLW. We've now had a couple of weeks to reflect on the Elimination Final. I was just going to paint the scene, or set the scene a little bit again. Jack Higgins kicks that goal, brings us back to within 18 points early in the last term. Saints fans starting to find their voice a little bit at the G again. Did any part of you think game on, or what was your reaction at the time watching the game?
Yeah, no, I think. Thanks for having me, Rich. I think at that point, and then the 3 goals down early in the last term, and they had played, they had dominated probably large chunks over the last, I suppose, quarter and a half, probably. Not to say the Giants didn't have some pretty good moments there in the third quarter, but I think at that point, yeah, it was game on. I remember even talking. I was covering the game, sitting in the press box, and a couple of other journos, and we were sort of discussing plans a bit, and you're sort of searching for a clear narrative. And I think at that point, I thought, it's still too early because the game could yet, the St Kilda could yet win, and or at the very least get very, very close, and that would change dramatically what the narrative of the day was. Clearly, it wasn't to be. But look, I think when you get to within that sort of margin, with still plenty of time to go, and it was a reasonably open game, that I think St Kilda was a chance, but as I said, didn't quite happen the way that Saints fans would have hoped.
Yeah, exactly. No, the chances were snuffed out pretty quickly, which is a bit of a theme through the game, really. Every time there was a quick shift in momentum, it kind of quickly snapped back the Giants' way, which was, probably pretty, a bit of a tough one for Saints fans to swallow after such a big build-up to the game as well. But I was just going to ask you, actually, how much did that performance redefine how you saw the season? I guess putting your Saints fan hat on for a moment. Obviously, there'd been a bit of chat about the real season being the finals, and Ross keen to see what Jack Sinclair and others would make of the real season. And I think there was a variety of reactions from Saints fans, at least on social media, in terms of being very grateful for the year, regardless of what the performance was. But what was your reflection on the game and how that kind of mirrored the year?
Oh, clearly, as a St Kilda supporter, you would have much preferred to win, obviously. And had they won a final, I mean, I think it would have been a pretty unqualified success the year, especially to win a final in Melbourne for the first time in what would have been 13 years. I suppose one drought, many droughts as a Saints fan, but another one goes on. Having said that, I think a huge achievement to make it in the circumstances, especially when you consider you're heading into round one when the injuries were mounting and you looked at the teams that were looking like putting out, and certainly even seeing that pre-season game at Rabbit against Melbourne. I know they did beat Essendon the following week, and you sort of go all the way back. You think, look, they've done pretty well to make the finals. Now, by the end of the season, they had a pretty healthy team, missing a couple, but not many. And again, it's funny in the way it turned out. They were missing sort of back to the start of the year when they were still lacking enough key forward support. And there was a brief period where they were all together. And obviously, we just want the best for Tim Embry, regardless of what happens football-wise. And it was unfortunate that Jack Hayes couldn't get up for it either after that brief taste that he had. But look, I think had they been thumped in the end, had a 7-goal deficit in the second term, turned into a 12 or 13-goal loss, which looked quite conceivable at that point, and we've seen what the Giants have been able to do to teams at times this year. Look at Essendon particularly, or even 7 goals midway through or in the third term, whenever it was, that time on, I reckon, had that gone, even at that state at 8-9 goals, again, different taste. 4 goals, were they ever really in it? Not really, but they were never, or they were only probably out of it from early-ish in the last, or sort of maybe 10 minutes in the last quarter. So you take 4 goal losses. I think Ross said it himself. They weren't disgraced. They weren't embarrassed. And I think the theme of the year overall, I think overall, if you hand out how the season was looking from ahead of the year, I think most Saints fans would have taken a finals return, and more importantly, how it was done. I mean, it wasn't done. Sure, they got some really good output from senior players, and they were always going to have to. But I think there's genuine and understandable buoyancy around the kids, and they got games into a host of 21 or 22 under players, and a couple of, and 3 or 4 noteworthy instances, you guys that are 19 or 20, and that's a huge achievement. So I'm not even sure Filippo's turned 19 yet, so he might have just turned 19. So it's the fact that they could do it with so much youth, and the fact that the youth was to varying degrees playing significant parts, I think gives serious cause for optimism, or much more cause for optimism than there was 12 months ago.
Yeah, no, I think that sums it up pretty well. I think you kind of hinted at the year of exploration, but Tom, our beloved Tom, always writing our match reviews through the year, or at least for the Elimination Final this year, actually wanted me to ask, was the entire lesson of the year of exploration learnt in the Elimination Final?
Well, it's the lesson that we'll learn, as finals of course do, and then whatever the last game of the year, particularly when it's a final, does. It will linger the longest because it's the longest break they have until the next game. And I think, in many respects, yes. I think there's an argument to say that's the case. I mean, it was when they were most tested, and it was a funny old year they had because, they played St Kilda did probably, when you look back at the year as a collective, played its best footy in the first 6 weeks of the season, when they were actually most undermanned. That's not to say they didn't play some good footy in patches thereafter, particularly actually in the last month of the home and away season. And particularly if you look at how Brisbane season's panned out, and I know the Lions didn't kick well that day, but the Saints were very competitive at the Gabba, and gave them some nervous moments late in the season. So, probably is that representative of St Kilda's season? It probably is, especially given the Giants show themselves to be a serious team and came, or a point off, I suppose technically 2 points off a grand final, but that won a 1-point defeat in the preliminary final. I think, we learned a fair bit from that day, and the kids, probably with the exception of, well, it depends whether you consider Cooper Sharman a kid. I probably don't quite consider him a kid. I consider him still an emerging player, but he's 23, so I wouldn't quite consider him a kid anymore. But the kids, probably with the exception of Messiah, didn't do much on Elimination Final day. But, I don't think you can level the blame at them for not winning. I think in the end, St Kilda was probably let down in relative terms by some of the senior players. Not all, because clearly Steele had an incredible game. And I think Marshall and Briggs was an interesting contest. I heard a lot of different. It's one of those ones where I think there were strong arguments to mount both ways as to who got the better of that one. But I think they both played well in different ways. But I think Brad Crouch and Seb Ross, both of whom particularly Crouch, had very good years, particularly Crouch. But in a final, they were sort of found to be second rate compared to Josh Kelly and Tom Green, and maybe a few more. And although they didn't have Cornelio, and particularly Whitfield and Ash and the halfbacks. I know it's sort of comparing different types of players there, but I think St Kilda's most experienced players were not as good as a collective as the Giants' most experienced players. Probably the Giants' kids were a bit better as a whole too, but The Giants probably didn't have quite as many babies as St Kilda did either.
No, I think their experience kind of did come to the fore through the day. Without going into the nitty-gritty too much, like there was even that passage of play in the final term where I think Riccardi missed the sitter from about 10 metres out. Then a mix-up on the man on the mark. Hunter Clark gives away the 50, comes back into the another shot on goal for the Giants, and then they back out to 5-goal lead, I think it was at the time. And I think, Ross, to your point about the midfield as well, you could read it as a bit of a backhander to some of the midfield crew, but lone hand for Steele in the midfield. And I think you said the midfield was spluttering midway through the year. So it was quite a candid press conference, a lot of stuff to tease out from it. But I was just going to say, actually, you may have hinted at it a little bit already, but for me, I think I didn't expect the Saints to win, unfortunately, going into the game. But I think the frustrating bit was probably it did maybe feel a little bit uncharacteristic, at least for a Ross Lyon team, to have that tsunami of goals through the back end of the first and midway through that second quarter. I think one of the things that going into the game I was reasonably trustworthy about was our ability to hopefully stymie the Giants to at least for a good portion of the day. But getting to halftime and then having chalked up 10, I think it was 10 goals and some relatively easy ones going end to end, not to take anything away from the Giants. I think that was probably the most frustrating bit for me, was how they kind of took the game away from us reasonably easily, without us having too many periods of pressure where we could build that pressure around the ball.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, it was certainly, well, if you look at St Kilda, look at Ross Lyon, any Ross Lyon coach team really over a long period of time. Occasionally, look, Freo, to be fair, in his last few years, there was the odd blowout, and he could be a bit loose in that respect. But certainly in the St Kilda days, was very rare. It was certainly extremely rare in well, it didn't happen in 2009, and it might have happened once in 2010, and only a handful of times across 2011. So very rare. And this year probably only really happened against Adelaide. I think that was the day where they were just cut up. But the interesting thing comparing that game, say that the Giants final compared to Adelaide, was that Adelaide really did jump St Kilda that day, and it was Mother's Day actually. Whereas against the Giants, St Kilda weren't jumped. The Saints were well in the game 15, 20 minutes into the first term, and then the Giants just kicked a few late and then really got going in the second term. I mean, I think it was probably already 2 or 3 goals at quarter time, but it didn't feel like the game was being played entirely on the Giants' terms. It didn't look like it was an overawed St Kilda team. This is when people talk about the memory factor. I thought that I probably would have given that a bit more credence had St Kilda been, 5, 10 goals down at halftime. Well, they were by halftime, but 5, 6, 7 goals down at quarter time. It just wasn't. It's not what happened. But yeah, defensively they were cut up. And look, the Giants, I think they're a good team, and they are. You look at their form across the last 3 months of the season, particularly the way they play, and when they are going at full flight, they played some excellent footy that day. But I think if you would have said going in that St Kilda would lose that game 10 goals to 7, you think, okay, yeah, I sort of see that. Whereas losing it, and it wasn't like they conceded a massive score. They conceded 15 goals, not like they conceded 25. But yeah, sort of the fact that they conceded whatever it was by half time was uncharacteristic of St Kilda, uncharacteristic of Ross Lyon coach teams, and not what you would have thought coming to the day. And the other thing with that is the MCG factor, and it was so rare. I mean, the Giants had next to no exposed Formula G. They hadn't played there since Mother's Day, again against Collingwood, and they've been touched up. But that was when they were a different proposition in the first couple of months of the year. And the Saints, conversely, had barely played there either. Beat Essendon, played pretty well that night, and then Richmond was the wet. It's hard to read too much into it, but I think that is the one thing that was probably a little bit made you a little bit nervous going into the game about the Saints playing at the G was how would they cover the ground? Because we know St Kilda cover the ground really well at Marvel, and they defend that ground very, very well. And Ross just, made an art form of defending that ground over both iterations as coach. Whereas the MCG is a harder ground to cover because it is bigger, and then they can just cut you up a bit more, and you just can't sort of those balls that you can sort of more readily usher out of bounds or just force to the we can force a secondary, force a stoppage. Just harder to do at the G. And I think we did see that for probably that 20, 30-minute period either side of quarter time.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, on that note, I guess two players that usually revel in playing at the G is Dan Butler and Jack Higgins, but both of them probably had pretty off days, to put it lightly. I mean, Butler ended up having 2 shots on goal, but both falling well short at pretty crucial moments as well. But yeah, that was just an aside. Actually, on that note, I actually think Jack Billings usually plays well at the G, but he wasn't all that close to getting into the 22 by that point. But just on Ross, before we move too far away from the Elimination Final, just generally, how did you find year 1 of iteration 2 of Ross compared to what you might have envisaged it would turn out like back in December last year?
It's a good question. I mean, it's funny because you really, if there's ever a coach where you should have gone in knowing what you're going to get, it was going to be Ross. But it also had been such a long time. It's been a long time since he coached at all, but particularly at St Kilda. And we're talking, 12 years. So that it was hard to know exactly what he was going to bring, or whether the game had evolved since he was at his pomp. If it was since St Kilda was at its pomp, or even Fremantle at its pomp under him, and the rules have changed to make it harder to defend overall. So I thought, maybe it won't. I was a little bit nervous, and I just don't think St Kilda has as much talent as either of those teams that he's coached previously had. This current St Kilda mob, that is. But overall, I think it was fun. I mean, I think particularly, it's fun because it was kids and they won early, and it just took so much of the heat out of the season. Because it was quite conceivable with the injuries that they had that it could have been pretty messy. It could have been 0-5, and then suddenly they are under the pump, and the very brutal call made on Brett Ratton would be looked at in a much harsher light very quickly. Perhaps not reasonably so, but just the way it works. But because they were winning those games early, it just took a lot of the heat out, and it meant the whole year could be played through a much more relaxed prism. They were in there the whole year. They only, even through that middle patch of the season, they went win-loss for a couple of months there, so that even when they weren't playing great footy, they seemed to, get and do enough often enough to keep the Wolves at bay. And it was only probably in the last, from about round 16, 17, thought, it's really fading here. And then they get out of that slump, which probably ended in the second half against Carlton. They actually played right first half against Carlton. And then came out and beat Richmond and Geelong, and the stars aligned with the Bulldogs, and they qualified. So I think, it was fun. There was a sense of nostalgia about it. I mean, as St Kilda fans, you don't have decades of great things to look back on, and the last decade has been so mediocre, and then there's had so few moments to which you hang your hat on. But there was this trust around Ross Lyon, because you look at Ross as safety, and there's this element of what you're going to get. Those were great days. They could, we know how close we came. So I think, it was a good, fun year, and the fact that they managed to get to a final. And the other thing about the final system, the final series stage, is a tiny thing, is because you get that bye week, you really do at least get to savour it. It is 2 weeks, and you're in the, and actually because St Kilda had known they were going to make it for a week before that, you had a good period to at least to enjoy it as a fan. And even though the day itself wasn't great, we still got the build-up and we still got to go to the MCG and watch the team play and cheer them on and have some excitement. And, Carlton and Melbourne got a week or two extra than we did. I mean, Carlton's probably the most comparable because it came out of the blue in a different way and came from a long way back, and it also come off a long drought. But huge excitement, and it's just been so long since they played finals in Melbourne. So it was a fun year, even though it didn't end as would have hoped.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head. And just in terms of one more thing about that elimination final day, actually, I agree with you in terms of the youngsters definitely got shown up for the most part, but at the same time, Nasiah Wanganeen-Milera really capping off a great year with he really grew into the game the more it went on, and kicked that great goal at the end of the third term, which I think will burn brightly in Saints fans' minds for a long summer. And I thought when Wintager as well, going to Cal in the second half, kind of came into the game, did quite well. Cooper Sharman, again, he's 23, so not exactly young, but he did, like his final, I'd say 5 to 6 rounds, including the elimination final, he really came to the fore. I think a lot of Saints fans, myself included, had kind of written him off. But he comes out of the season being one of the shining light, I think Ross said in the press conference even. So he kicked 2 goals, one. I think Lockie Whitfield probably takes the chocolates in that matchup, but I think Cooper still like really, I don't know if you go as far as saying breakout game, but it was definitely a really good performance on a big occasion, obviously.
Yeah, and Sharman's one of these guys that when he came in mid-21, and there were just been flashes, particularly in that first. I reckon it was that first year. He actually probably showed quite a bit. I reckon he might have played that last game of 2021 against Fremantle and looked like he was really kicking along quite nicely. But for whatever reason, he's thrown end to end. Had other guys that they tried. He's one of these guys that his best looks so good because he's such a lovely mover, and a genuine aerialist, and he flies for so many marks, and occasionally takes them. And he's got, you can tell he's got footy smarts. There's a fair bit to like about him, and it was nice to see him, show a bit. And it is just that it's that medium forward, which I suppose Membry has played that role, but it's not a role where St Kilda's had a lot of luck over a long period of time. It was almost back in the grand final years. There was always that talk of who's St Kilda need to find that medium forward, and it was Tom Lynch was the one they sort of looked at for a while, and clearly that didn't work out at St Kilda. But he does look like he can be a nice mid-sized player in that forward line mix. And he's not a huge disposal winner, but he can find the ball. I'm pretty sure Sharman in his draft year was sort of seemed to be a bit stiff to miss out, and obviously went into the SANFL and had a bit of success there. Now there's something I like about him, I don't know if he's going to be a star, but I think he's shown enough that he can be a viable AFL player, and certainly worth persisting with. In short, this is one thing I'd say that my views haven't changed a year on, and probably have thought of this for a couple of years now. St Kilda ultimately has to build around Max King. That is the crux of it. They have one clearly generational player. Now, mind you, he hasn't fully delivered yet, but he had an injury interrupted year and still had some pretty good output. And he's still very much young enough to be a superstar. And then from there, it's just building around him. So when I look at it's almost like the King Matrix or the King question: who is young enough, good enough that they can be a piece around Max King? And I know you don't want to be just one player, but if you're going to build one, he's the one. And Cooper Sharman can be. Now, whether that's second banana, third banana, I don't quite know, but he's nice, especially when you consider that hopefully Owens will play more midfield going forward, and they are similar size players, and you're probably not going to have Owens there as the second. And if you think that in the long run, as Membry probably comes towards the end, that Caminiti, who I think the jury's still a bit out on, I'm not 100% sold on Caminiti. Like, it was good to see him play a bit this year. I think he showed signs. I think there's some holes in his game that make me wonder whether he's going to be a long-term AFL player. But you look through those pieces, you think King, Sharman, maybe Caminiti, Hayes is a bit older, but still young enough if you get his body right. There's some nice pieces around there that make you think it can be a functional forward line in the long run.
Yeah, I think it's, in terms of year of exploration, we've probably got the most exploration in that forward, the forward six, if you like. Ross obviously had his hand forced to a degree with the early injuries, but a lot of good came out of that, getting to canvas all these options, like you said. So I think Caminiti, it was a bit of a harsh lesson for him in difficult circumstances coming into that final. Started really well, took a great mark on that forward flank, but then probably had a pretty, went missing quite quickly. Unfortunately, catapulted into Filippo in the second term when we were trying to stem the bleeding there against the Giants. But yeah, I was going to ask you, I think some of the critics of Ross, even in the recent past, would say in his first stint at the Saints and at Freo, he came into lists that were, quote unquote, ready-made or, ready for contention, more or less. Would you say 2023 kind of reassured fans on that front? I don't want to take any, well, the whole development group, obviously, but that's obviously spearheaded by Ross. And they were comfortable to play Philippou against Tom Green in the middle in that third quarter as well. So they're obviously very committed to the development front, even in the, biggest occasion of the year. So do you feel like the likes of, Owens, Windhager's development in back half, Sharman we've talked about a little bit as well. Philippou obviously burned brightly early on, probably, ran out of gas pretty quickly in the second half of the year. Do you feel like, the growth of the group kind of points towards Ross being the right man on that front as well?
Look, I think it certainly showed that he is, and perhaps it was a bit more out of necessity this year, certainly early, and then I think once it was out of necessity, he was very loyal to everyone really who got a game regularly. I mean, it was a little bit once you were in this year, and there weren't many guys who really fell out of favour that played a lot of senior footy early in the season. I may have forgotten someone, but even guys like that might just
Stocker got dropped.
Well, even then, you're right. Yeah, but even then, I was about to say Stocker, but then even then, you still end up playing 21 games. I reckon it was about 21 games, and even then, he was still a sub in the final. It wasn't though he sort of fell off the face of the earth. And when they were going for fringe guys around the end, it was still, they went back to Caminiti. They went back to Stocker as the sub. There might be one I'm forgetting here. I mean, they were lucky in the sense that they didn't actually have too many injuries once the season got going, and the injury list did. There were quite a few repeat injuries within the rehab group, but it was more those guys were continually getting injured rather than fresh guys getting injured. I mean, Seb missed a bit of footy for a bit there, and they went back to him at the end.
Maybe Burns fell out of favour.
Burns is probably one. Burns is probably the one. But even again, it was not as though there were line ball calls. It wasn't as though like he gets around 14 and you just forget about Ryan Burns. Like, he was still a sub in the penultimate game, obviously in round 24, and then he was still he probably was next cab off the rank come the finals, and it was just kind of probably one midfielder too many then for him. And I think in hindsight, easy to say, I probably wouldn't have minded his run on the MCG. Whether they could have gone. I mean, I don't know. You probably had to play Caminiti in the end, but I wonder if they'd gone in and slightly shorter, played Stocker and then Burns as the sub. Who knows? I know that there was talk about whether you might have brought in Howard instead, played him forward or swung Cordy forward. None of these are particularly good options. So I don't think it's the difference in a 4-goal ball game. But look, I think it shows that Ross has a willingness, and he's evolved. I mean, he shows a willingness to play kids. You look back to sort of 2007 even, and he played, the kids that was by necessity. I remember it was that game where they played Phil Raymond, Justin Sweeney, Brad Howard, and David Armitage all made their debuts when they were really undermanned against Hawthorn. And most of those didn't amount to anything. And Armitage clearly did, but the other 3 didn't. So they showed a willingness to play guys, but maybe Raymond didn't play. He may not have played, but maybe I'm thinking maybe it was just Sweeney, Howard.
Sweeney and Howard, yeah.
I always confused Raymond and Sweeney. That's a pretty deep dive for Saints fans. Whatever it was, I reckon they were 4 debutantes that night. Maybe it was just 3. Maybe there was 4 late changes or something. Anyway, the point being that they played kids. They got a fair bit out of kids, particularly Owens and Wangan and Miller. I mean, I think Philippo, he's one of the classic signs. It's you see what's special about him. It's just they're just the moments in games. To a lesser extent, you could say the same about Caminiti. And Windhager is interesting. I mean, when Windhager came in and was making a big impact last year, before Owens was, everyone was sort of like, Windhager, he's found one here. And, you see that big body burst through against Geelong in that game they won at Marvel. He had some really good moments. And I remember talking to even some recruiters from other clubs, and there was a sense that this is probably what Windhager's going to be. Like he doesn't have the upside that Owens has, and then you see Owens comes on and leaps and bounds because he's, so special as a contested player, skillful, that got the size. Whereas I think Windhager, I can see Windhager being a viable AFL player. I'd love to be proven wrong. I can't see him being a star. I just think he's a big-bodied Brumby who will plough in there, and is a disciplined 2-way midfielder. And clearly, 2 coaches have now been comfortable giving him jobs, so that says a lot about his character and his diligence. And you know what? If he's the Clint, I don't know. He's the Clint Jones to Philippo, Owens, and Wangan and Miller is sort of, Del Santo, Hayes, Montagna. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying they're all going to be that, but that's, you know what I'm trying to say here. So, look, plenty from the kids overall, and Ross has shown that he's willing to play them.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I was really pleased that even through the dark, as the season really nosedived through, 2/3 of the way through season or halfway point, there was some of it was forced through injuries. Obviously, I think Philippo probably would have really been on the brink of being dropped a couple of times there. Should there have been some others available, but it was good that they stuck to their guns, and hopefully it pays off. If not next year, then over the next 2 or 3 years. But I was going to say, actually, speaking to some friends who are obviously big Saints fans as well, it was interesting at the end of 2020, obviously, when we made that run to the finals under Brett Radden, Hunter Clark, Caulfield, and even Ben Patton all featured quite heavily in that season, in that kind of fairy tale kind of run. We, to one extent or another, the club obviously got ahead of themselves. I think it's pretty safe to say 3 years on now. Got James Frawley. We all know what happened in 2021. How confident are you in the current brain trust about them knowing where the list is at and not getting overexcited by Owens and the young gang?
Reasonably confident. I think the fact that they were talking the club down, they were talking the list down from the start of the year privately, and Ross sort of publicly still acknowledging big holes, particularly in the midfield, is a sign of they're not getting ahead of themselves. And the whole idea of year of exploration. It's interesting with that whole Gags ball approach, is that I think that you look back at that 2019, and I know you're sort of more talking about the end of 2020 when they did then bring in Frawley and Sean McKernan. And there might have been one other there. There were a few others they just kept topping up. Supposed to be fair, one of them they brought in was Mason Wood, who's a pretty good player. Man. But and no one would have imagined how good he's been. But I mean, I think that end of 2019 you look at, and then you probably even go back to the Hanbury deal, but particularly end of 2019, they were so desperate. There was so much. It was just so sick of how long it was taking, and there'd been such poor recruiting and list management for a long period before then that they just wanted to be a destination club. And yes, they overpaid for some of these guys. But you look at each of Ryder, Howard, Jones, Butler, and Hill individually have played some very good football for St Kilda. And I wouldn't say any of them have been abject failures at any level. I mean, Ryder played about as good as footy as I don't think anyone has played for St Kilda since the grand final. I mean, really, his best was unbelievably good. It wasn't long enough. Jones was actually, really good in 2020. Butler was outstanding in 2020. Hill's, in the end, he's been a good player for St Kilda, just not a $900,000 player for St Kilda. If Brad Hill's on 600,000, you wouldn't have any issue whatsoever. He's been a really good player for St Kilda. And Howard, particularly I think in 2020 and 21 was really good, and then has just faded, and some of the he's had more of his Dougal moments, and I don't think he sort of endeared himself to Ross Lyon across a few things, which led to him being out of favour by the end of the year. But look, in short, I don't think they'll get carried away because of the way Ross spoke. You're always a little bit nervous, and particularly when they start getting linked to guys that you just, I don't know if they're absolute, Liam Henry I think is a really good player and he's played some really nice footy, but you just don't want to overpay. Now, thankfully, he's young enough that he is in that Max King realm. If they were talking about overpaying for, a 27-year-old, I'd be getting really nervous. If there was a Brad Hill out in the market now and they were talking about it, I'm trying to think of the player around the league. I'd hate for them to get into James Harms. Like, I don't want a piece of James Harms, for instance. That's a sideways move. James Harms is, you don't bring in, like, there's this Dylan Shield talk now. Only if that's I can only think that's a good move if it is a genuine back scratching deal, to help ease the passage to a first rounder for Jay Gresham, in which case shouldn't be allowed by the AFL. But if it is going to be allowed, you'll take it. But only in those circumstances. Like, they just should not be bringing in guys, over the age of 23. That's a bit extreme, but there's no need for it. They've got to build. I'd rather them take a step back next year, and continue to build around what they have, than get stuck in another one of these loops where they're a mid-table team. Because if you do look back at the last, really, with the exception of 2018, the last 8 years they've been somewhere between a point. If you look at the American parlance, a 0.4 and a 0.6 team. They're winning somewhere between 4 and 6 out of every 10 games. So with the exception of 18, where everything went wrong and they were horrendous, and I don't know how they were that bad that year, but they just were. And Richo was clearly his papers were marked by that point. And what happened at the start of 2019 just delayed the inevitable. So I think they just got to be so careful not to get stuck in that loop. Like, I'd rather them take a couple of steps back and just try to get more quality hits through the door, because they've got a few now. Like this time last year, I knew they had one in King, and there was, Underside had shown some signs, but now, and Windhagen had shown some signs, but now I think you can be very bullish about King. And there's no guarantees, because you still said the same about Clark and Caulfield and Patton, and Dougal was still quite young then. Even Zach Jones wasn't that old in 2020, but I think they can be pretty rightfully bullish about Owens, Wanga and Miller, King, and there's enough to like it from Filippo and Windhager, and then you throw in a Stocker who's young enough, and there's starting to be a few pieces there. You're like, all right, there could be a core here, and you need a core. But you're not going to get a core by bringing in sideways players. Like, as I said, they're not to labour the point, and there's not a particular knock on this. This is not a go at this guy, but a James Harms, because it just doesn't do anything for you.
Yeah.
Or is it, who I'd be worried if I bring in? Like Zach Fisher. And they're not, because you're going to North. But he's a guy he's 7 years, 7 years into his career, no list, and he's just a player. And like St Kilda got enough of those guys, and they have for a long time. They've got, if you want another player, guys that age, around that age, and it's just a player, well, play Jack Billings for the next 3 years.
I was just thinking during the week, actually, the only hard bit about that is seeing, and we can probably go back and have other examples of this, but just seeing the final series that Blake Acres just had, and just suddenly having a burst of, well, was he in just that dysfunctional environment that we didn't see the real Blake Acres? But I tend to agree. You could almost, to an extent, compares a Zach Fisher to a Jade Gresham in terms of definitely has had his moments, but has been in the system through multiple coaches as well, where it just hasn't really clicked.
Yeah, and Gresham, Gresham is one of the great, and this is why you sort of, you don't want to let yourself get so swept up in, say, in Owens, who looks a special player, but God, I thought Jay Gresham was going to be a superstar. I mean, a superstar, but a star. I thought Hunter Clark had some really special attributes. I think he still does. I think Gresham still does, but they just haven't strung it together over a long period of time. We're now talking in Gresham's case, and he's had injuries, but it's 8 years, and Clark's case 6, and there's just enough exposed form to think, I don't think it's going to get much better than this. Not to say they can't piece it together for time at a period. They're just teasers as players. And it looks like Clark, I think, is now more likely to stay. But Gresham, it's just so frustrating, because you thought you had a guy who was a really good contested player, who had really good goal smarts, who could kick you. He was sort of tracking to being a bit of a Toby Green type.
He was at Dusty Light at one point.
Yeah, 100%. He's 2018. He was the only player that was excited about in 2018. But it just hasn't happened. And, I don't think there would, he had more than enough chances this year. He was really patchy at times this year. His attitude was found wanting at the times this year. I've never been quite sure about his professionalism. There's been something that's just been a little bit off. That's not to say that he's not, he hasn't. It's the one percenters, and I'm just not sure he's a one percenters guy. And I just think, put it this way: you've never heard of Jay Gresham. Not everyone's a leader, but you've never heard of Jay Gresham being spoken about as a leadership type. And I just think that's always a bit of a red flag. And I just think he's not going to be going to be what we hoped he was going to be, and certainly not for St Kilda. Well, I don't think it's going to be St Kilda. I think he'll be at Essendon next year.
Yeah.
And you just hope that St Kilda gets something good for him.
You touched on it before, but if St Kilda were to come out of the trade period with 2 first-round picks, even if they had to eat Dylan Shield's contract for a year or so, I think that's I'd be reasonably happy with that. That's.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's just the worry is what they're gonna have to pay for Henry, because Freo have invested a lot in him, and not to say you invest in a lot, it doesn't mean clubs invest in players all the time, but he's a player that they've put games into when he's coming into his own now, and they've lost a lot of players in recent times, which makes you a bit nervous because they might want to make a point. I mean, I do trust Sauce and Gubby not to overpay because I don't trust Gubby not to overpay, but I trust Sauce not to overpay from a draft perspective. I trust him to drive a hard bargain, but it's just a little bit of a worry. You just wouldn't want to give up your first for Liam Henry. I mean, if it was maybe it's a pick slide. I mean, it depends how strong you think the draft is around that part of the draft, and I think the one obvious downside of the year that they had was they're not going to get a really early pick. But I think you'd take it for the ride that they went on, and we've had enough bust with early picks to know that that's not necessarily panacea anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I mean, talking about the list, we can go through all. We could probably do a whole podcast just on the list, but if you're putting on your list manager hat for a second, what would you say are the major priorities, particularly in the short term, to inject into the list? I mean, from my point of view, and we've probably talked about it a fair bit already, and particularly on the back of Jack Bytel getting bid listed as well, the midfield, beyond your Steele, Crouch and Seb, it's very thin. Even just from a depth point of view next year, if you're trying to factor in contingencies for injuries and whatnot. So I think the midfield is definitely like a priority. But beyond that, it's probably a bit more unclear. I would say, you touched on some of Deagle's form through the year. I think a tall defender is quite a big need as well. From my point of view, like the back six, I think I'm quite comfortable with, generally speaking. But I mean, we can't expect Zane Cordy to be shutting down Jesse Hogan this time next year. So in terms of the short term, what do you think are the priorities?
I think with St Kilda at this stage I think you've got to take a bigger picture list build here, and I still think they're not in a spot yet where they need to be nitpicky, when they need to be picking guys for particular spots. I mean, yes, you always have that broader view. I mean, obviously you always take everything like that into consideration, but we're not at a stage where, because I don't think St Kilda's going to the premiership next year. I don't think they're going to be, and this, I think one of the question coming up, I don't really think they're going to be a top 4 contender either. I think if they could hold ground, if they could be somewhere between 5 and 8 ideally, but no, even 9 or 10, but with the kids having greater influence and responsibility, I think that'd be a win. So I'm still not massive on there's a particular hole there that needs to be filled. I still think you just got to bring in better talent across the board, because there still are, while they're still a youngish team a lot this year, there's still some older guys playing most weeks who aren't necessarily going to be the answer. I think in the long run, it is the midfield from a depth perspective. Hopefully hopefully Filippo, Mitch, Windhager are, that could be a nucleus in 2 years, with probably Steele still there, and then maybe an aging Crouch. I don't think Seb will still be there, and maybe Hunter if he stays. I wouldn't be worried about a depth midfielder, because I think you can pick up a depth midfielder so easily. I would be taking, if there's a depth midfielder there, you can go and pick up Reece Matheson for nothing at the end of as an example, as a listed free agent or mid-season or pre-season supplemental player who just plugs a hole, and you just if you have 3 or 4 injuries, a couple of injuries, you put him in there. I'd be just trying to find, I think Henry's the right type of player to be going out and getting, someone with pace, with skill, on the outside. I think you just more to develop what you've got at the moment and then bring in quality. I mean, I think from a key defensive perspective, James Van Ness might be the answer. I mean, it's too early to say for sure. There's a few of these guys that this is one thing which, while there was exploration in some respects, there were a few other guys that weren't really explored, and he is one of them. I mean, I don't quite know what Isaac Keeler turns into in the long run, but I could see him. I think he's the kind of guy that you could see in several positions if he makes it. And clearly it didn't work out with Oscar Adams.
Ollie Hodden, people speak.
Yeah.
Well. Yeah.
Hodden had again, I didn't watch enough of Sandringham this year, but by all accounts, is kicking on quite nicely. So again, there's some nice pieces there that, hopefully something comes up through, but it is speculative, because I thought 2 or 3 years ago, Leo Connolly might be a neat little player, and he's gone. He just didn't kick on. I mean, Jack Parrish they got rid of after 1 game, which I was pretty surprised at, but given he's tiny, it must be something that they just don't rate about his game, or just don't see him being big enough, or having the attributes to make. So, I think broadly speaking, you're right. It's probably midfield and 1 key back. But it's not a situation where I'd be I think the thing is, they're not a position where you'd be reaching for any particular player. If that player lands wherever it is in the draft, or there's an opportunity to get a player that fills one of those gaps, I'll be taking them for sure. All other things being equal, I just would not be reaching. If they brought in, I don't bring in 4 key forwards, but if they brought in 3 or 4, if they think the next 3 best players in the draft are all midfielders, I don't think that's a massive issue, because it's easy to turn midfielders into. I know this can be fraught, but there's enough around the league where you can turn a midfielder into a flanker or a role player. But you can't turn a bad player into a good player.
Yeah.
And I think you just got to bring in as many good players as you can get. I mean, I'd just like to see, wouldn't it be nice to see Sandringham make the finals once ever? I mean, that's been a debacle, really, and it's not. I don't know, that's multifactorial, but for instance, they just haven't had quality there across the second tier, and it's because there's been a dearth of quality lost across the list. And of course, Sandringham plays a role there, and mature age players, but they just haven't been. It's been so rare to have St Kilda players that are dominating every week at the lower level, that can't crack in for a game. I'd rather have them, because the thing is, you bring in players like that, and they can give you trade value. I mean, you look at the Salvator Galea, he's a fringe player. Brandon Zerk-Thatcher was on the cusp of Essendon at times, or the Giants. If you lose someone, you just bring in another one, and eventually these guys play roles. Bobby Hill was on the cusp of the Giants team. They lose him, but they brings in a decent pick. So I'd just be getting the best. It's a cliche, but it's best available. It has to continue to be.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, in regards to how aggressive they're going to be in this coming off season, I think Tom wanted me to ask: this is devil's advocate for sure, but is everyone bar Max King, Jack Steele, and Machado Owens effectively tradable?
Oh, look, yeah, it's interesting. I mean,
certain commentators say that Jack Steele is decent trade bait. But
I mean, it's funny with the Steele thing. Like, I get the rationale. Like, I get where they're coming from, and it's a sort of it's the complete opposite to what the list management was 4 years ago. Like Steele's and I'm not convinced Steele's going to be captain next year. I think there's some serious doubt. I would be not at all surprised if Cal Wilkie is captain next year. I just get the sense that Ross, not that he has a particular knock on Steele, but I think that there are attributes of Wilkie's leadership that seem to endear. It seems to be more what Ross looks for in a captain.
Yeah.
And that it might just ease a bit of pressure on Steele, allow him to get back to his best. look, that whole thing of, what's it, the trade table. I mean, everyone's on the trade table because if you were offered Max King for, I don't know, Charlie Curnow and 2 first rounders, you take it. So it's not like everyone's on it. It's just what the price, it's whether you're actively, it's whether the club is actively pursuing them or not, or actively putting these things out there. I wouldn't be completely shocked if they were sort of at some level, at least floating still to see what they would get for him. But do I think he'll be at St Kilda next year? Yes. Do I think, I suppose you only know what you know. I can't see any enormous shocks there. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if Billings left, but I don't know if there's a clear candidate for him. I still wouldn't be surprised if Howard left, although it sounds like he wants to stay and sort of fight for his spot. And from there, I'd be pretty loath to give up Rowan Marshall. But, if there's an unbelievably compelling price, it's St Kilda. It's what is going to get St Kilda. The question is, what is going to help you win the second premiership? And if Rowan Marshall, it's just a hypothetical, trading Rowan Marshall is what you think is going to help you get close to your second premiership, well, you trade Rowan Marshall, but you don't do it lightly.
Yeah, and I think to your point before about Owens, Philippou, and Messiah and Windhager, as much as Owens was brilliant this year, we probably just haven't seen quite enough yet to think that he's the guy in the midfield. He's the guy, the Dustin Martin, the Clayton Oliver, the Petrarca of this midfield. So until that person is there, you're still kind of weighing up, how do we get to that person? It's one thing to have Max King at one end of the ground, but having that engine room is just so critical, like we saw against the Giants, obviously. But yeah, I was going to say, have we seen the last of Jack Billings at the Saints, do you think?
Probably. I don't know. I mean, there's no clear candidate for him yet, and clearly the money will be a deterrent. Clubs, I don't think he's on enormous money, but really, what he's shown last few years, just shouldn't be on much money at all. I think there'd be an appetite from both club and player for a fresh start if it was mutually beneficial. But I guess as I said, I don't think there's an obvious candidate. But I think the thing about Jack Billings is he's the kind of player that he's a cream on top player. You don't want Jack Billings. You don't want Jack Billings to have to carry your midfield. But if Jack Billings is your, is your sixth midfield rotation, or he's playing on a wing, if he's Isaac Smith's a better player than Jack Billings. But if he's Blake Acres, I don't think Blake Acres is good. Blake Acres is a really good couple of years, but he's been playing in better teams than he ever played with St Kilda. If Blake Acres had played St Kilda this year, it would have been better, but he never played in a good St Kilda team. So you just don't know. So that's what I think Billings is at as a player. That's where I think the alternative is just a salary dump, and but I think the salary dump you'd have to give something. It would be, and St Kilda's not trying to get out. St Kilda's not trying to offload. I don't think St Kilda's caps in a space where they need to be offloading money to a North Melbourne, giving Jack Billings and a first rounder to North Melbourne to get more space for someone else. I would be very reluctant to be doing that. You move Jack Billings on if you can get a late second rounder for him, and even that's probably generous, but and you wish him good luck and say, it's been real, and thanks for a pretty underwhelming decade.
I mean, he wasn't the only one, but unfortunately, he'll be remembered as the one ahead of Bont, and that's just a harsh reality, isn't it? I'm conscious of your time. I just want to ask you, what were your high and low point of the season as a Saints fan?
Uh, I think the high point was, yeah, it's a good question. I think the high point was making the finals. I mean, beating Geelong in that second last round, especially given that they'd been in, it looked like they were in, it was in serious doubt. And they had to, you know what it was? It was because they sort of had to make the finals again. They didn't just coast into it. They had to actually work for it. And I know they slipped out of the 8, but they slipped to 7th for a week there, and it was like, oh, it's going to happen again. After a similar thing happened in 2022. And they fought and they played really well and they beat Geelong and they did it. And they beat Richmond as well, who were not going that well at the time, but it was still a solid win and they had to do it. So qualifying for the finals. But the Geelong night was special because Marvel was pumping about as much as I can remember it pumping for a long time for a St Kilda game. It was not 09-10, but it was, or certainly not, or 04, but it had elements. Particularly at the end, as the guys were celebrating, Rowe sort of celebrated that goal out towards in front of the fans there at half forward. The low point, I think this is any finals loss is a low point. Well, actually, probably the real low point was losing to Hawthorn. That was the point where you thought this is, because until that point, no, actually, so the equal low points, losing to Hawthorn, losing to Gold Coast. Those were really, you just shouldn't lose to those teams, particularly Hawthorn, but even Gold Coast was very Richo era. That was one was like, this is such a, that was the one that had me back to the Richo era the most. It was like, they've shown a bit, they've strung together, I know by that point they were already flagging a bit, but they've actually strung together a bit of decent footy, and it's just all going to fall into, a pile. And at that stage, it looked like it was going to. That combined with Hawthorn are probably the low points. And that's why, to their credit, they actually got back, played better footy and earned the right to make it, notwithstanding that the first 6 weeks gave them the breathing space to allow those losses, but they still had to go and they couldn't just coast in. They still had to go out and win against Richmond and Geelong. And they did it and made it for what was, a good year. If not a great, I don't think it'd be a great year if you're an elimination final loser, but it was a good year, and I think a year that St Kilda fans overall will look back on, in history, will look back on pretty fondly.
Yeah, definitely. I'd throw up 2 other candidates. This Carlton loss at the back end of the year felt like, I mean, Marvel was pumping for a very different reason that night. Felt like the roof was caving in on Saints fans. And it did feel like a bit of a sliding doors kind of night as we were kind of seemingly slipping out of the 8. We saw a real finals team, quote unquote, really surging towards the finals. And also the win against West Coast, that was a very anemic kind of win. It felt like we were really, I think we'd spent all our petrol tickets at that point. I think Ross's defensive system looked like it was really, you didn't know what was going to happen in the back half of the year really at that point. But
that was, yeah, no, well, that and even the North, look, this is where I think St Kilda fans got very, I didn't like the whole narrative of St Kilda fans attacking. First of all, who cares what the media or pundits say about, what do they call it, power rankings? First of all, who cares? But second of all, like, St Kilda played some horrible footy for several weeks there. Like, they just scraped past West Coast, just scraped past North, lost to Hawthorn, lost to Gold Coast, lost to a middling Richmond side. I mean, what are we? It's ridiculous to think anything other than they were a middling at best side for an extended period there. So I don't. This is where this whole idea of like, oh, people have underrated St Kilda the whole year. No, I think at the start of the year they were playing really good footy and they were being rated fairly, and then they played some really poor footy and they were being rated fairly, and then at the end of the year they were playing better footy and they were rated fairly again. And it's just the way the season panned out, and they deserved to make the finals because they won enough games when, they won enough games to make the finals, but it didn't mean they didn't play some very ordinary footy. Anyway, I just thought St Kilda fans got very precious about that. for no real reason.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think some of the pride had been restored in the faithful,
Yeah.
which was good to see. And I think Ross embraced that, being
Mm.
that kind of us against the world kind of mentality. But
Well,
yeah,
that is one thing. I think the thing with Ross is he does make you, again, sort of, you are sort of, again, proud to be a St Kilda supporter. They're not a joke of a club anymore. And Rich, unfortunately, not so much under Ratton, but particularly under Richo. I mean, it was just, they were just so bland and mediocre, and they were irrelevant. I mean, they always talk about North Melbourne as a relevant club. St Kilda was such an irrelevance for so long, because they weren't. Because the other thing with St Kilda is they weren't having these huge sagas either. It was just this irrelevant club that would sort of meander through seasons, not going anywhere. And Marvel was such a sterile ground for it when they're not winning. You sat through so many very underwhelming days at Marvel through the Richo, Waters, and maybe a little bit of Ratton years. That it was just nice to actually have a year where St Kilda were a force at some level again.
yeah, absolutely. Thanks heaps for your time. Great to chat properly. Let's not leave it for another couple of years this time, but hopefully we've got a lot to chat about in the new year. But yeah, thanks, and keep up the good work on Code Sports, obviously.
No worries, Richard. Likewise, mate. Good to chat.
Take it easy. Cheers.
See you, mate. Bye.
Yeah.